Well, hello, everybody. Apologize for the technology. My name is Frank Burrows, and I'm the Parks Manager with the town of Saugeen Shores. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Saugeen Shores experience over the last 10 years or so. And okay, next. Okay, so for those who don't know Saugeen Shores is the amalgamation of Southampton and Port Elgin, and it's the area between Kincardine and Southampton up on Lake Huron. We're known for our beaches. Southampton has spectacular beaches, and Port Elgin has been, for a long, long time, been a beach destination. 18 kilometers of waterfront along Saugeen Shores, and there are beaches and there are some natural areas. We don't have any large wetlands or really significant ecosystem complexes, but it's your traditional Lake Huron shoreline, which I think it's creates some unique challenges into how we manage that shoreline. Next slide. We have a waterfront stewardship program, which is really trying to manage the waterfront ecologically and wisely. It's because there's so much interest in the waterfront, from public beaches to private cottages to natural areas. It becomes quite a juggling act of doing what is the right thing. And we certainly, what we find is everyone has an opinion on how the waterfront should be managed. And sometimes those opinions aren't always environmentally sound, but the individuals believe they're environmentally sound. So it's quite a balance about, stressing the value of active dunes. Merriam grass is not weeds, it's critical vegetation. And so we do a lot of stewardship on how to manage the shoreline, and it has a lot of interest in many. One of the things we're going to talk about today is how we manage invasive species such as Phrag. Next slide. So Saugeen Shores is fortunate, and I think that's really the part of the story today, is we don't have any of these massive colonies of phragmites that have taken over. And I'm going to hopefully describe necessarily why. And so we aren't responding to wetlands that are smothered in dense phragmites mats. Next slide. What's going on in Saugeen Shores right now is more of these isolated patches. Some are fairly significant patches with thousands of stems, but others are just individual stems or small patches along Shores waterfront. And that makes the management challenge in many ways easy. And many of you may think that's very fortunate for us that we have that situation. I think in many ways it is. But at the same time, we don't have those sort of massive patches that can give crises and give a very clear visual that they have a problem here. We need to manage phragmites. So I think we've had to really encourage, be proactive about saying, well, we need to, as I sometimes say, we need to keep the horse in the barn. Once the horse is out of the barn, we're in trouble. And that's why we need to have an intensive Phrag management program before we get these dense, very problematic infestations of this invasive Phrag. Next slide. So what we've formalized, we started in about 2010 or a bit before that in basically spraying phragmites, and a lot of it was done by our roads crew that would then expand it out into the natural areas. But in about 2016, we tried to be more systematic about how we're managing Phrag, particularly on the along the waterfront. And this is where we formalized our monitoring program, and we've actually had a summer student dedicated to the program for the majority of the time. So that's really what I'm going to talk about now. We did some management in the early days, but we don't have a lot of documentation on that. And that certainly management, which was spraying along the shoreline in more of a reactive mode, was, I think, very successful at keeping the phragmites in check. But we don't on that, so it's anecdotal. So next slide. So the program now, many of you know, you go out and GPS locations. So what we do each year has a student goes out and walks the line and GPS location and is able to map them. Next slide. And then, of course, they collect attributes. And it's fairly basic attributes. It's location, access. They do the best estimate of number of stems, if that's practical, or they do a length and width and area of the patch. Next slide. We also do photo monitoring, and for a lot of the sites we have the same look every year, so we get a clear visual of what's going on. Next. So was 19, this is 20, and the next slide again. Oh, we skipped one, yeah. So sometimes we don't see a spectacular visual like, oh my God, look at the change here, but it captures what's going on that and on that patch in a very simple way with a photo. So once we have the inventory done, then next slide. Most of our work has been through backpack application, and we've had increased the number of people that are trained that allow us to do this. So spraying, of course, out of the water. Next slide. In locations such as the cattails, the farther patch out further, you can actually see Chantry Island in the far background. We do have some frag that's been flooded in more traditional wetland environments where it hasn't obviously taken over yet. And again, most of this what you're seeing are cattails, but there is some frag mixed within it. Next slide. So we're doing the manual cutting techniques, and this is one scenario where we use the cutters. These are borrowed from Saugeen Valley Conservation Authorities, but we also have Janice put us onto the hooks that we can individually cut stems. So we manually cut these in the flooded areas. Next slide. And we get lots out. So we basically remove it and take it to the landfill. And of course, on hot summer days, our summer crews this job. Next slide. So we're going to show some monitoring data here, and this is some summary data that shows results of our inventory and removal programs. So by location since 17, overall, if you look at the bottom lumber, the grand total, we were doing quite well. Went from almost 5,000 down to 1,500 stems. And these are typically stems, and this isn't super rigorous, but it's a reasonable estimate that summer students can do. Again, I think our sort of level of accuracy on the measure, it doesn't have to be perfect. We just want to see the trends. So you saw overall we were dropping significantly, and then a bit of an issue in 221, which I'll speak to. But most areas were successfully controlled. Take a look at Fairly, 80 stems in 2017 and down to 3. And we're hopefully it's going to stay low if we keep on it. Other places like Goldman's Grove or along near High Street, we've eradicated. It's been consistently gone since 17. So overall, I think we have great success in some areas. Other areas such as Saugeen Beach, it's popped up. But overall, the control techniques over time, and I think if we went back to 2010 or earlier when we had some of the early control work, the numbers would have been much. But unfortunately, we don't have that data. We just can do from anecdotal evidence. Next slide. We're also looking at in water, out water, and try to separate that because, of course, Lake Huron went from extreme low water levels in 2013 to extreme high in 1920. So the Mother Nature with water levels is radically influencing these shoreline patches. And we've tried to sort of tease apart flooded versus non-flooded locations and how they're changing. Next slide. And then this is a summary of eradicated sites. So these numbers demonstrate that we've successfully completely removed in grand total 162 frag locations have disappeared on the Saugeen Shores shoreline. Sometimes they're very small patches, 30 or 40 stems to several thousand stems, so it's quite variable, but we've been successful in some specific areas, as this data shows.
2 minutes remaining.
Sure. Okay, next slide. I'm just going to wrap up. Next slide. Click again. They're going to come up one at a time. Yeah, so I think we've shown overall in the last 10 years, phragmites has not taken off. We haven't seen those postcard photos of invasion of phragmites, which I think is probably the most important monitoring result. But now we've got into more sophisticated monitoring, and it's not high science, but it's just a little bit more quantitative monitoring. We're seeing very specific sites over locations. We saw a real peak in 1/2. And that shows there's a whole bunch of variables going there, and that's where the monitoring data can't separate it out. Partially it was COVID and staffing issues, our permits. We had some delays with them. And that created some issues that we weren't able to spray as effectively in 2020. Next slide. The record high, how water levels influence this. Honestly, I think in many ways, high waters have eradicated a lot of the incredible change on our shorelines with the low to high, and understanding how high water influence it. We may be assuming our management techniques are the success factor, but it actually is just maybe high water. So as the waters start to drop now, we really have to pay attention. Next slide. And they also identify problematic sites. Like we've had a bit of an explosion down at Saugeen Beach. So that's where we really want to focus our efforts. Next slide. So overall, in summary, I think many webinar know that the rigorous monitoring is critical in informed management, but I think it's a real challenge at sometimes for municipalities to keep focus on it. And I know a lot of groups are using volunteers. I think we need to be careful about data we use or impressions we use, that we need to ensure that it's good data to base our management response on. Some people have said, well, the Phrag has disappeared lately, so why are we spending all the time on control? And I say, well, because we need to keep on top of it. Again, I touched on the role of high water. I don't think we should become too complacent with the water dropping. We may have a increase in recolonization of the Phrag. Next one. I think the challenge of not having crises, we don't have a sort of a massive colonization or dense patches in Saugeen Shores, that sometimes makes it more challenging to get a narrative that we need to invest and spend the time on it in a proactive way. It's sort of a reverse logic, but it's important that we continue to communicate that we need to keep the management program going so we don't have a crisis. And again, I think the critical message of our is right now are relatively inexpensive, and they certainly will be less expensive and more effective than waiting for colonies to take off, and then we have to involve very aggressive control techniques. So I guess keeping that message clear to council and clear to stakeholders in the area. Okay, and I think, and that ties to continuity. I think one of the challenges of municipalities is keeping the continuity. There's staff turnover and priorities change. Municipalities don't have a conservation mandate per se, or mandate's very diverse. So trying to keep focus on things like Phrag control programs, the continuity is critical. So hopefully we'll always have a champion in the area to keep the program active. The risk is you lose a couple of champions or staff turnover, and the program sometimes could fizzle out, and then we're back to the scenario of some of the Phrag expanding very rapidly again. Okay, so I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Frank, and also for highlighting a lot of the really key points, the monitoring piece, and pointing out you don't have to be a scientist to do this, or it's not really rocket science, but it certainly helps with the program. And also to you mentioned about the continuity and staff, and thank goodness they are very fortunate, Saugeen Shores, to have you with your parks background and your ecological background, understanding the importance of keeping this program going. And you can certainly articulate it well, I'm sure, that they don't have to look too far to see what could happen if you don't keep this program going. There's lots of examples where that early detection, rapid response isn't in place yet, and it can be quite overwhelming to get going on it. So thank you for that. I'm just going to see if there are any questions. There is one question here. Which pesticide license is required for the work that you're doing?
So we have, and I'm not an expert at that because I'm not licensed myself. So we had some staffs, and you may know better, Janice. They got they went over the 5-day course and got the. Honestly.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so there's the landscape. There's a forestry, landscape, aquatic. There's a number of them depending on, there's the industrial, depending on where you have to be. For your situation on the shoreline, it would be the landscape exterminators. Yeah.
So that was a key thing. We had a couple of key staff that we did sent away for the 5-day, I think it's a 5-day course, and then they got their license, and that them to do the work. And we did multiple staff, so we have continuity with the staff too. But it was pretty straightforward getting the licensing once we figured it out. I'm not licensed myself, but so I don't know all the technical details, but it's straightforward once we sorted it out.